By most early indications, Israel's attack on Iran's nuclear program and its military leadership was a stunning success. Significant portion of Iran's nuclear infrastructure have been damaged, if not destroyed. Now, the question that we need to ask, in addition paying attention to Iran and Israel at this moment, what role does the US play at this moment? Whether the US could end up getting pulled into the war not of its choosing depends on several factors that for now are mostly unknowable. What do we know about Iran at this moment? And some scholars believe now this time Iran is going to have a much stronger comeback and also roll out officially they called Iran's grand strategy. Historically speaking, how do we understand the economic and also the political ambition for the country, and what will be the grand strategy for Iran? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to invite our distinguished speaker. Our speaker is Professor Vali Nasr. Professor Nasr is a professor of international affairs and the Middle East studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And he's the author of the amazing book, which is called Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History. Well, Professor Nasr, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you.
Well, Professor, I want to get started looking at what's happening today. And again, going back, what happened since last Friday until at this moment. What do you make of Iran's reaction? And also, as I mentioned in the intro, how do we believe that this ongoing war between Iran and Israel is more likely to pull US into this ongoing tension? Your thoughts?
So, the rivalry between Iran and Israel has been going on for a long time. It goes back to the early years of the revolution. It has ideological roots to it. But also it has become more and more intense over time. And particularly Israel is very worried about Iran developing nuclear weapons, which then would change that rivalry in very drastic directions. The rivalry turned into much more of a hot war once Hamas, which is very closely allied with Iran and had been trained and funded by Iran, attacked Israel on October 7th, 2023, and then Hezbollah, Houthis, other allies of Iran joined the fighting. And then Israel was fought with them for a year. It looked like Israel was under a lot of pressure. And what happened is that eventually Israel proved to be very capable of decimating Hezbollah. And the tables turned against Iran. Now, I think Israel sees an opportunity to use this advantage that it has right now, with Iran basically having lost its footing with Hezbollah, with Syria being more in a defensive mold, to basically decisively downgrade Iran as a state, as a military, as a threat to Israel, and eliminates its nuclear program. So Israel was not interested, or is not interested in a nuclear deal, in a diplomatic solution to Iran's problem. It's more interested in a military solution that not only will destroy the nuclear capabilities, but also, as I said, will make Iran a much smaller player in the Middle East. Iran, on the other hand, took advantage of the fact that the United States' thinking is a little bit different from Israel. The U.S., particularly under President Trump, said that it doesn't want war, that it wants a nuclear deal to see whether it's possible to stabilize the situation militarily, economically, otherwise, by having a nuclear deal with the U.S. Now, the nuclear deal proved difficult, much like other deals with President Trump, looked to go very fast and then very slow, and then, with threats, etc. But it hadn't finished yet. They were actually supposed to be meeting last Sunday for the sixth round of talks. But before those talks happened, Israel attacked Iran. And that basically disrupted diplomacy. Not only attacked Iran, it also killed a number of senior Iranian officials, has attacked Tehran, has created a lot of, social disturbance, etc. Now, the Iranians perhaps thought that one of three things happened here. Either that President Trump really has no control over Israel, and Israel has the last word. So Israel decided, whether they're negotiating, not negotiating, I'm going to decide that this is useless and I'm going to attack when I want, which then basically could lead to the question, why talk to the U.S. at all if the U.S. is not basically capable of managing the situation? The second conclusion could have been that the United States was playing a game all along. It wanted to attack. It wanted Israel to attack. So it essentially kept saying, we want to talk to Iran, went through the motions, but in reality was not really looking for a deal. And the third option is that President Trump decided to let Israel do this because he thought that it would soften Iran's position. And now it might have got out of hand, but that was the intent. Now, all of these make in the future of nuclear negotiations more difficult because partly Iran now is in a war, is in a complete war with Israel. I mean, Iran and Israel will not be fighting with tanks and artillery because they're not neighbors. So this is the way war happens between them. So Iran feels like it cannot let Israel win. And at the same time, it cannot go back to the negotiating table without showing both Israel and the U.S. that it's much more of a power than they assume, and is not as weakened as they would like. Right? So that's why they need to retaliate. And the fact that they were able to retaliate is perhaps a bit of a surprise here because they eliminated the top leadership of the military. And now Israel's desire is that the next level of escalation would involve the United States, particularly because they say that some of Iran's nuclear facilities are deeply buried under mountains. Israel cannot take them out. It needs American long-range bombers, B-2 bombers, and 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs, and that the United States has to enter the war. The U.S., I think, it's possible it will do it, but it has to also calculate what it means to enter this war, because then it has to think about how this might go forward in ways that the U.S. may not welcome.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio said, and I quote, U.S. was not involved and that Israel acted unilaterally. And of course, that as the Secretary of the State mentioned, even got deeper with a statement. It says America didn't need a heads up because we know what's going on, end quote. Professor Nasr, from your perspective, when we heard such a statement from the U.S., especially from the higher officials, what kind of message did that send to the international community? I mean, again, we understand at this moment, it will be foolish for U.S. to get involved into another war. I mean, again, Donald Trump is not done with the war in Ukraine, and Donald Trump is still looking at the international conflict. Now, at this moment, by reading the statement from Marco Rubio and by understanding that it says that America didn't need a heads up because we know what's going on, but U.S. was not involved and Israel acted unilaterally. What kind of message did that send to Iran and Israel? What do you think of that?
I mean, it's first of all not believable, largely because we don't need to be given a heads up because we know what's going on. Almost says, okay, we knew what was happening, but we didn't stop it, which is the same thing as being involved. To say that the U.S. was not involved, which means that, okay, our radars, our airplanes were not involved. But to the Iranians, and sometimes in diplomacy that's useful because that creates space for you to move in. The planes were not Americans. The pilots were not Americans. There was no American flag on anything. But Israel could not and would not have done this without American knowledge and approval. Now, I think the reason why I say this is two things. One is you want to signal to Iran that we had nothing to do with it. We weren't involved, which means that the path to the negotiating table is still open, but also because you don't want him to retaliate against U.S. troops and U.S. bases.
That's right.
Which then would force them to go into the war. But in a way, to the Iranians, this looks like the U.S. wants to have its cake and eat it too. It doesn't want retaliation from Iran, but it basically approved an attack by Israel, providing it with a green light. Now, the key question for Iranians is why would they do that? I think that's a more important question. What was the U.S. objective here? Especially, I think the Iranians share your view that the U.S. doesn't want a war. That's why these generals who were killed, assassinated, were not hiding in a bunker. They were sitting at home watching television, and some of them died with their families. Why? Because they thought the talks are still ongoing, right? And the U.S. will not allow an attack while diplomacy is ongoing. So then, if that's not the case, that raises the question about what were the U.S. motivations here? What was it trying to gain by letting Israel go ahead with this attack?
Well, Professor Nasr, let's talk about your book. Again, this is a fascinating book, and certainly it's a fascinating read when we talk about Iran's grand strategy from this political history perspective. This is something that you wrote at the beginning of the book, and I quote, "This book focuses on the origin and the development of the strategy over the past 4.5 decades, shaping Iran's international outlook and foreign policy, and organizing state, society, and economy to realize its national aims," end quote. Professor Nasr, from your perspective, again, you are the expert and you wrote this book, but to us, when we understand, or when we try to understand the phrase, it's called the national aims related to foreign policy, what is that aim? Or what are the aims that Iran is trying to achieve these days, or even perhaps from a historical perspective? And we know that for every single country, economy is the priority. Political stability is the priority. So what are the specific national aims for a country like Iran is trying to accomplish when we look at the uncertainty of the world? Your thoughts?
So yes, the economy is a priority, stability is a priority, but those are not national aims, right? So let's take a country which you're probably more familiar with. What are China's national aims? What were China's national aims under Mao? And what were China's national aims under Xi Jinping or under Deng Xiaoping? So when Deng Xiaoping wanted to develop China, was that the goal or was that a means to a goal? Right? Is prosperity just a goal or is it a means to something else? Now, I'm not a China expert. I can venture here that the idea is for China to be a great global power. The idea is for China to be independent. The idea is for China to be free from imperialism. Now, Mao had one view of how do you protect China's independence, and I have to say there's some parallels between the way the Islamic Republic thinks about national independence, which are similar to Maoist China. Like Mao's China, Iran had a huge experience with imperialism, with chaos in the 19th century, and so keeping the foreigners out, creating national cohesion, unifying the country. These were all national goals. Yes, communist ideology was there, but national aims were there. So when Deng Xiaoping took over, yes, he replaced prosperity for communism, but some of the national aims didn't change, right? The national aim still was for China to be a great power, to be protected, not to be bullied by the outside, to be prosperous. In fact, prosperity was seen as an element of power, not as an end in itself, right? Now, you could say the Islamic Republic in Iran has lost that balance. Like Maoist China is doubling down on resistance. We're going to resist the United States at all costs. We don't want to have any relationship with them. We don't want to have them to have an embassy. We want to develop without globalization. We want to develop outside globalization. In fact, recently, 2 years ago, the supreme leader said, well, now the Russians and the Chinese are learning the lesson we already knew. What did they gain by becoming globalized? Although it's a very simplistic argument. Basically said that China and Russia went through all of this, globalization, etc. And the minute that they began to become a threat, look, the Americans turned against them, right? That's the mindset in Iran. So, some of the way they think is not rocket science. Sometimes that's one purpose I wrote this book is to say, don't get too deep in that everything in Iran is decided by ideology, right? That this is all religion and ideology. Behind it, there are these goals like national independence, standing on your own feet, keeping the country free of foreigners, wanting to be a Middle East great state, right? But the way they're going about it is not the Deng Xiaoping way, right? They're going about it with saying, we don't want to have anything to do with the global economy. We don't want to normalize with you. We want to build our own industries. We want to be left alone, right? And so that strategy is now being severely tested because it's proven to be a very costly strategy, right? Because they get more and more sanctions, and so their ability to actually develop becomes less. They're ending up in a war over this strategy. And also the Iranian population, unlike in the 1980s, which was supportive of the revolution and all of its goals, is no longer interested in this strategy. It wants Iran to be a normal state. And then the Iranians will say, okay, look, the Chinese are not getting along with Americans, but they're not under massive sanctions. They have a passport, they can travel, they can be part of the world, et cetera, right? So, in a way, Iran took that kind of a Maoist view and just sort of drilled down. And it hasn't had this Deng Xiaoping moment of to say that, yes, we want to be a great state, we want to be independent, but the path to that is economic prosperity. And how do you get economic prosperity is the way Deng Xiaoping said, you keep your head down and you just take whatever the global economy, Americans, et cetera, are willing to give you. And then when you are powerful, then you stand up to them, which might be now. But the Iranians haven't sort of figured that out. But the issues are not that different.
Well, Professor, let's talk about another perspective in your book. Again, this is something that you wrote. Iran must overcome the challenge through resistance, economic, political, and military. Iran has not progressed on the goal of its Vision 2025 as planned, but it has invested considerably more in resisting America. Professor Nasr, from your perspective, what is the goal of the Vision 2025? I mean, we are in the year of 2025. And also, how do we even assess that Iran's strategy to resist America? How does that work? Because we know that prior to Donald Trump appear in the picture in 2016, former U.S. President Barack Obama basically, I would say, roll out this grand strategy to and hoping that the relationship between the two countries will even get better. But appear on the stage that 2016 Donald Trump, the first term, and also we're looking at the second term. Iran has been on the radar for Trump for so long, and this is not this prosperity period. So both countries are also watching what's happening, how to move. It's like a chess game. So again, Professor, from your perspective, what is the Vision 2025 for Iran, and how do we understand the strategy to resist America from Iran at this moment? Your thoughts?
So the Vision 2025 was written in about 10 over a decade ago, but it's very clearly and the reason I mention it is that it brings to the surface that there is a fundamental contradiction in Iran's approach. So Vision 2025 stated that Iran wants to be economically developed, it wants to be a leader in technology, economy, everything in West Asia. So it's not that different from visions that other countries have put forward, except that Islamic Republic has been proceeding under the assumption that you can have economic development without engaging the West. In fact, you can have economic development while fighting the West, while actively resisting and rejecting the West. Now, there are many who would say, including in Iran, that you cannot look at any country that is developed in modern time period, which has been basically dissociated from the West, was opted out of the world system, whether it's Japan, China, Russia, Europe. So that's a fundamental contradiction, right? So Iran's sort of worldview is that it has to resist the West. It has to reject the West. It has a sort of anti-imperialist attitude towards the West, but yet it wants economic development. So yes, it's achieving some things, like Iran's economy is completely cashless. Iran's capable of producing missiles without any Western, support. Iran is capable of doing many things, but Iran is falling far below its potential in terms of economic productivity, in terms of what it can be, in terms of poverty in the country, in terms of achieving the goal set before itself. So the fundamental, I would say, flaw in Iran and the supreme leaders' vision is this assumption, which is it always starts from this assumption that you can develop while resisting and confronting the West. Zero cooperation, zero engagement with the West, fighting Israel, following revolutionary, hardline, confrontational policies with them, and yet being economically developed. So again, going to Asia, you could say, Iran has elements of North Korea and South Korea. And it can be both, right? North Korea is the maximum of where resistance is, much more than Iran. And South Korea is the maximum of global engagement, right? And you have to choose one, right? You cannot have a Vision 2025, which is a South Korean kind of a vision, and then a foreign policy, which is a North Korean vision.
Right.
And so as a result, they're finding themselves where they are.
Professor Nasr, I have two more questions before letting you go. Now, Let's talk about the revolution of 1979. And again, for most of our viewers, we know that, it might sound a cliche, but what happened in the past either shape us to a brighter future, or what happened in the past could lead us to another disaster. So from your perspective, the Iran went through the prism of 1979 revolution. Why is that critical for you to include in the book when we look at the grand strategy? So in other words, for people, especially the younger generations, to understand there are dissatisfaction among the youth in Iran today. There are economic concerns or economic uncertainty for the country and political instability for the country. But from the historical perspective, how did 1979 revolution impact what's happening today, or even perhaps especially to the day-to-day basis to the people in Iran? Your thoughts?
Well, Iran's 1979 revolution was one of the world's great revolutions, on par with China, Russia, French Revolution. And we're only 40-some years away from it. It's not that far. I mean, at some point, revolutions are like volcanoes. At the beginning, it's hot and humid, but at some point they calcify, right? Iran's revolution essentially has run its course in terms of popular support, ideological fervor, etc. But the state and the establishment that is still running Iran is the product of that revolution. We're not a generation away from that revolution. We're still being led by that revolution. In other words, Ayatollah Khamenei, who's Iran's supreme leader, these commanders of the Revolutionary Guard, many of senior Iranian politicians, etc., were people who carried out the revolution, right? We're not completely out of the shadow of that revolution. Whereas the younger generation that is born in Iran, majority of Iranian population was born after the revolution. So they don't necessarily share the arguments that led to the revolution. They don't necessarily remember activities that led to the revolution. Now, every revolution at some point runs its course and transitions. So the way China transitioned under the same Communist Party, basically, was still ruling China, is very different from the way the Soviet Revolution transitioned into Russia, right? We still don't know how the Iranian one will transition. In Vietnam, the transition was different, and so each of these countries will ultimately go through that transition. There's a point at which, because of change in leadership, because of certain realities that faces the country, that you basically, the first generation of the revolution gives place to something else, right? And we're right at the edge of where this might happen in Iran. It might take 10 years, it might take 2 years. But we're exactly at that point where, what came out of the revolution is likely to evolve into something else.
Professor Nasr, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, your new book is called Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History. We are still looking at what's happening in Iran and Israel. This matters not only to the two countries, and also to the international community. So for any of us, or even for our viewers and listeners who aren't familiar with Iran's grand strategy, what are you hoping that viewers and readers to understand when we finish reading the last chapter of this book? Because to be honest, I'm still not done with your book yet. But the more I read, the more question I have. It's a fascinating book. And again, as we look at the war between the two countries. So briefly, from your perspective, what are your expectations from the readers? And why is it important for us to understand not just the history, but a political history of the country? Your final thoughts.
Well, I mean, the history that I'm dealing with is political history, largely because it's not arts or culture or social economic history. But by that, I mean that, the way the Iranian government looks at the world, the way that it calculates its objectives, how to pursue them, etc., is drawn from history. That this was not born in 1979 or in today. And ultimately, if you're going to understand a complicated country like Iran, and understand why it's fighting Israel, why doesn't want to make up with peace with America, why is it so suspicious of the outside, you have to understand its mindset. And mindset means assumptions, the way you analyze the assumptions, the way you make conclusions. These are all part of understanding, and you cannot figure out what drives them without understanding. It's like, what happens if the United States bombs Iran? It's not satisfying to say, well, because they're clerics and because they're religious, this is how they will react. It's the other way around. You have to look at to see, based on how are they likely to interpret that, and then what is their definition of nationalism, identity, sovereignty, etc., and then how might they react to it. So I'm glad it raises more questions than curiosity, and I don't mean to say that this is definitive, but it's to say that there is a certain way of thinking in Iran and a certain logic, a certain set of assumptions, and a modality of thinking shared by people who make the big decisions on foreign policy and national security. They may be wrong, they may be right, they may be right sometimes, wrong sometimes, but to understand it, you should put aside presuppositions and try to understand them in their own terms. And in order to do that, I looked at how they debate and discuss this. And now there's an enormous amount of archives, memoirs, interviews, etc., of Iranian leaders, scholars, etc., that basically discusses these sorts of views, and you can actually look at the way in which they think and they reason and make decisions.
Well, again, Professor Nasr, it's such a fascinating book. Again, it not only
Thank you.
that only when we dive into the book, it talk about what's happening at the moment, and also, again, as I mentioned before, history tend to teach us so much that we don't know about the world. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Professor Vali Nasr. Professor Nasr, it's a international affairs and the Middle East studies at the Johns Hopkins University, and I strongly encourage everyone go online, check out this amazing book. It's called Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History. Well, Professor, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay attention what's happening to Iran and Israel. So thank you so much for doing this.